preservation of and increased access to the 92nd Street Y Humanities Audio Archives is generously funded by the National Endowment for the Humanities.
Nice to see you this evening. I'm Rabbi David Woznicka, director of the Wise Bronfman Center for Jewish Life, and I want to introduce to you Mr. Jay Goldberg. Mr. Goldberg is the chairman of the partnership that we have at the 92nd Street Y with the American Friends of the Hebrew University. As you know, I'll be speaking about this momentarily. Hebrew University co-sponsors this event. Mr. Goldberg is also past co-president of the American Friends of Hebrew University, Greater New York region, and also an active member of the American Friends National Council of Trustees. Those of you who were with us last year for our program with Isaiah Gaffney probably remembered him, so it's a pleasure to introduce him to you, Mr. Jay Goldberg.
Good evening. It's a pleasure to be here tonight to initiate the series on four great Jewish thinkers that we're co-sponsoring with the Y. And on behalf of the American Friends of the Hebrew University, I'd like to give a special thanks to Rabbi Woznicka and his staff for putting this together. Let me say a few words about the Hebrew University, and then I'll get off and let you proceed with the evening. The Hebrew University was established in 1925, so it's now 70 years old. And it's grown over the years from a small university to a very large one of 23,000 students spread across 4 campuses in various parts of Israel, obviously headquartered in Jerusalem. And it is a world-class university. It's a university that leads Israel in research. In fact, half of the research that goes on that's called basic research in the state of Israel is conducted within the Hebrew University. Approximately a third of the members of the Knesset are alumni of the university, and its graduates are leaders in virtually every field. 7 out of this year's 15 Israel Prize winners, which is the prize given for recognition in Israel, it's the highest recognition for achievements in the scholarly community, are Hebrew University professors. The leading prize probably in the world in the field of computer science was awarded to a Hebrew University faculty member, and just recently a cure for influenza B was developed by a doctor at the Hebrew University's medical school. And lastly, and maybe most importantly, for those of you that don't know, both behind the scenes and in the news, the Hebrew University is one of the leading players in the peace movement that's going on in the Middle East today. Now, the American Friends is an organization that supports the Hebrew University. And as part of that support, we sponsor functions such as tonight. We have a calendar that's very rich in program, some wonderful people involved in supporting the university. We would welcome your support. We would welcome your help. Leah Rosenfeld is here tonight. Yair Kagan is here tonight. I'll be here later. If you have any questions about the university or about the American Friends, we'd love to answer them. And lastly, it's a great pleasure to be here. And let me introduce again Rabbi Woznicka. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Goldberg. It is, as you know, always my want to whet your appetite for some upcoming programs. I won't, since we have programs virtually every night of the week, it's a little bit difficult to select, but some of those that are particularly, maybe a particular interest to you, I just want to point out. Rabbi Joseph Telushkin is going to be speaking on Sunday morning, December 18, Words That Hurt and Words That Heal, the Ethics of Speech, and also a Morning Sunday Institute and what we call our Everett Institute, the focus of which will be the Messiah and Afterlife. Rabbi David Wolpe will be the speaker. On January 18th, Malcolm Hoenlein, Executive Vice Chairman of the President's Conference, is giving our annual State of World Jewry address, perhaps certainly among the most prestigious addresses that we have here at the 92nd Street Y. In February, an evening on the issue of values and character with the Council for Character Council, a whole question of how do you inculcate values in the next generation in America. Among the people on that panel, slated to be on the panel, is Tom Selleck. Tom Selleck is the national spokesperson for Character Council and an exceptionally articulate spokesperson, I might add. In March, 3 evenings that I think you'll find of particular interest, Rabbi Joseph Telushkin returns and joins me in a series of dialogues, each with a different guest The Forum on Contemporary Values obviously focuses on the issue of values. We're going to be probing our guests on the whole question of not what their value, what their decisions are in life, but how they make those decisions. On what basis do they make their decisions? In the past, we've had some interesting guests ranging from Alan Dershowitz to Jack Kemp to Elie Wiesel. I won't name them all. Coming in March, our first guest is Dennis Prager. The following week is Natan Sharansky, and the following week after that is A.M. Rosenthal of the New York Times. So should prove to be a very interesting series. And then finally, in May, again co-sponsored by the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, a program called New Challenges for Israel and Jerusalem. The guests include Mayor Ehud Olmert, the mayor of Jerusalem. I was going to say new mayor, but not so new. It's been a while now. Shoshana Cardin and Professor Shlomo Aronson of Hebrew University of Jerusalem. So those evenings, we look forward to being particularly special. Before I introduce Professor Yovel, I want to also take a moment to acknowledge Hebrew University and the work that they've done in co-sponsoring this program and previous programs with us. Those of you who have been in attendance know the quality of people they have brought to us, and in particular, I want to publicly thank Yair Kagan and Leah Rosenfeld once again for really working so hard to make these programs as nice as they can be. Also, you should know one of the real pleasures of working with American Friends of Hebrew University, and I know this is one of the longest introductions you have ever heard me give, but this will vindicate me. They bring a nosh with them. They bring food with them. And it's not that Jews need an added incentive to eat, but if you need an added incentive to eat, and by the way, the food is right after the program in the room directly behind you, Professor Yovel will be there as well to answer your questions. He's got a lot to pack in the hour. He may not have the opportunity to do a Q&A, but if he doesn't, he promises us that we'll have some opportunity to work with him informally. But as I said, you probably didn't need an incentive to nosh, so please know that you're cordially invited. The topic this evening is Maimonides and Spinoza. Those of you who know Professor Yovel or know of Professor Yovel, and those who are now going to hear his biographical sketch are going to know just how fortunate we are to have him with us this evening. I'm just going to wait till those chairs. Are we finished with the clanking? Okay, thank you. Professor Yirmiyahu Yovel is the Shulman Professor of Philosophy at the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, where he also chairs the Bergman Center for Philosophical Studies. A graduate of the Hebrew University, Professor Yovel is an internationally known Kant and Spinoza scholar. He has authored numerous articles and papers and several books and anthologies on philosophy, including Kant and the Philosophy of History, and the critically acclaimed Spinoza and Other Heretics. His visiting professor appointments include, but certainly not limited to, the University of Milan, Hamburg, the Sorbonne, Princeton, City University of New York, Columbia. He has been at Oxford and England, also in Paris, which makes the whole perspective of being a university professor all the more palatable, I should say. He is also founder and chairman of the Jerusalem Spinoza Institute, which works towards education for pluralism and democracy. Through seminars and lectures, the Institute educates new immigrants, soldiers, high school students, teachers, as well as the general public about the importance of tolerance between different religious, ethnic, and political groups in Israel, as well as the importance of the democratic process. Professor Yovel was a senior news editor with Israeli radio for several years and hosted a talk show on Israel television. He continues to contribute political and social commentary on a regular basis to the highly regarded Haaretz newspaper and to Israel's most widely circulated newspaper, Yediot Achronot. Please join me in welcoming Professor Yirmiyahu Yovel.
Good evening. Thank you very much, Rabbi Woznicka. I don't think I can see anybody. Now I can, but I can't hold my hand like that a whole evening, can I? I just told Rabbi Woznicka that I had an impossible mission for tonight, speaking about two major Jewish thinkers, each of whom deserves perhaps a whole seminar. So unavoidably, I will have to stick to very general patterns and ideas and perhaps do injustice to both of them. I'll try, however, to do more justice to Maimonides than to Spinoza, because for two reasons. One, a very important reason, he comes first. And the second is that I have devoted some work in writing about Spinoza, which and also about Maimonides, but less. The idea for this. Can I get rid of those lights in my eyes so I can relate to the audience a little? I'll use my time well. Thank you. The idea was to, in this series, was to speak about Jewish rationalism, or rather the encounter between Judaism and rationalism. In what extent was this encounter possible? To what extent was it successful? How can Judaism historically and rational thinking be compatible, despite the very strong tension that exists between them? Another question I'm interested in posing is, what does rationalism mean in various periods? Rationalism is following reason, human reason. And we think of human reason as universal, unchanging, but it was not. Our concepts of rationality, of what reason is, have changed over the years. We have had different paradigms, different models of what rationality is. And in each period, in each era in which Jews were trying to make peace or to make some alliance with rationalism, they have had a different paradigm of reason before them. Now, that tension is also known as the conflict between so-called revelation and reason, or between religion and science, and so on. It's known under different names. It is also a very well-known problem in our own times. In modernity, it's really one of the accompanying features of Jewish modernity, that this conflict has become much more acute in the last 2 centuries. Was the world created in 6 days? Can reason accept that? Is Darwin right, or the book of Genesis? Do we accept miracles which break the continuity and the determinism of the laws of nature, or do we accept only the causal laws of nature? Does God do acts which surpass or are contrary to logic? Even beyond that, can God assume a human image? Can God look, think, act, behave like a human being? All these seem to be contrary to what reason, in its various scientific and other forms, seems to suggest. Christianity went even one step further. God himself became human. He became a real, finite, carnal human being. The Jewish rabbis have always mocked this Trinity idea, mocked the Christians. They said this is a superstition. It is even idolatry. They also said that the Trinity goes counter logic. It goes against reason. But if so, then the rabbis themselves accept reason. They accept, to some extent, they accept as legitimate claims which criticize religion in the name of reason or in the name of avoiding superstition, because they are using the same arguments, presumably in earnest, against the Christians. That makes them, the rabbis themselves, the Jewish thinker, Jewish religious thinker themselves, open to rational arguments against them, or to further rational argument. And all the question is, to what extent are they also open to it mentally? Because you can be logically open to something, but mentally close to it. Refuse to go along with what is logically implied or required. In any case, the tension, which I do not have to elaborate more about, exists with everyone who is not ready to stop and to shut down, to shut up any argument by saying this is how we got it, this is how it is in an orthodox way, and there is no further talk about it. Whoever is not ready to give this answer is open to some rational argument, sometimes to his or her own rational argument from within, which evokes criticism, skepticism, questions. Some of them are quenched, some of them pop up, and there is not only polemics between people, but polemics within a single person. That openness to argument, to criticism, is therefore legitimate for anyone who wants to think about religion, or also who wants or wanted, because I will start with the Middle Ages, who wants or wanted to purify religion of its crude elements, to purify it out of its superstitious elements, and so on. Irrational, illogical superstition, and so on. But that also represented a danger, which the rabbis always noticed, and therefore they were not very pleased with philosophy. They sometimes were very harsh and dogmatic about stopping philosophizing, because they noticed the following danger, which is obvious. The danger from a religious viewpoint is that in that process of purifying religion, of making it more refined, less crude, less superstitious, more authentic, a person sometimes may end up outside of the religious sphere altogether, as happened to quite a number of people in the Middle Ages, and as happened in the very outstanding case at the beginning of modernity to one person I will be speaking, if I get to him, at the end of my talk, Baruch Spinoza. Now, I plan to examine these two cases. One, the case of a person to whom that result could have happened, but did not, Maimonides, who stopped at a certain point, who avoided this result, and even, somewhat paradoxically, and yet as a matter of great important fact, has become the greatest rabbi and the greatest legislator in Jewish history of the diaspora. That's Maimonides, Rambam. At the same time, we shall see that he also had some far-reaching purposes, goals, which he did not attain, but rather which failed. I'll talk about it a little later. And the other one, Baruch Spinoza, in a certain respect, his disciple, at least his reading disciple, because Maimonides' book of philosophy, Moreh Nevuchim, The Guide of the Perplexed, was very probably the first or one of the first philosophy books that the adolescent Spinoza has read, and which affected him, although he went beyond him, and we'll see the differences later. Spinoza then, who did leave all historical religion, gotten out of them completely, and made reason, the intellect, into the one and only religion. A religion of universal reason, which goes beyond the particular religions based upon some special revelation, like Christianity, Islam, and his own Judaism. Now, because of the shortage of time, I'm going to very briefly, I hope, examine these two men, these two thinkers, according to three questions. First question, what is their image of the deity? How do they conceive of God? Second question, what is their prophetology, theory of prophecy, of the prophets? And third question, their image of Judaism and the role of the mitzvot, the role of the particular religious commandments. So let's start with Maimonides. You may find my description of Maimonides unorthodox at certain points. maybe it will be incompatible with some more pious descriptions of Maimonides that you have heard. I will take responsibility for that. Now, Maimonides was the greatest philosopher in Judaism, at least until Spinoza, and based upon his Moreh Nevuchim, the God of the Perplexed, and at the same time, he was the greatest rabbi and legislator in the diaspora based upon his compilation of Jewish law known as Mishneh Torah or Hayad HaChazakah. Mishneh Torah actually means in Hebrew second to the Torah, or even a second Torah, and we'll see in a moment why this ambitious name was used. Now, how these two things, being the greatest philosopher, rationalist, in medieval Jewish history at least, and being the greatest rabbi and legislator and compiler of the Mitzvot, how these two things are compatible is already a question. People say he was a synthesizer, he wanted to bring together two worlds. Everything is nice and fine, but how do you do it? Can they be brought together? Did he actually succeed in it, or was he torn between them because he wanted to bring them together? Is an important and interesting, even fascinating question. I will come back to it, but I will already say that there is something enigmatic about this, as there is about the man. The problem already stood before his own contemporaries, some of whom put him to the ban, not him personally, but his books. And they knew what they were doing. They felt that there is something heterodox. Heterodox is the contrary of orthodox. Not completely heretical, even though some of them did say that this was heretical, but heterodox, which is dangerous and should be suppressed, as they thought. Well, they were of course wrong to ban his thinking, but they were right to sense the tension which some of our contemporaries who have put Maimonides on the pedestal and who have made of him a great national hero have some have tended to round out, to do some excessive false harmonization of that tension, which his own contemporaries were very quick to identify. In any case, a few points about his life. I'll do it very fast. He was probably born in 1138, although tradition says it was 1135. Was born in Cordova under Muslim rule in Spain, when the center of world philosophy was in the Arab world, in the Muslim world. And he was really working and growing in the center of world philosophy. Philosophy was then transmitted to the West through the Muslim philosophers who translated, interpreted, and so Aristotle and the Greeks, especially the Aristotelian tradition. He was himself an Aristotelian, in 90% Aristotelian. He was growing in Andalusia, in Spain, under not only Muslim rule, but under a rare eruption of Muslim fanaticism. I'm saying a rare. Today we see so much Muslim fanaticism and we think of it as the rule. It is not the rule. Fanaticism in the Muslim world was rather the exception than the rule. That was one of the exceptions, as our own time is another exception. That was one of the exceptions in which the Muslims stopped the tolerant regime that they had in Spain. That was this kind of a sect called Al-Muwahhidun, and they demanded that Christians and Jews convert to Islam. They also controlled Morocco. They were on both sides of the Straits of Gibraltar, and there was no escape. Maimonides' family, he is a young man, his father, his brother, who later died, went into inner exile in Andalusia. Then they went to Morocco, but there is great probability that they converted, that they became coerced the Hebrew word is anusim. They became coerced converts to Islam, but false converts, of course, who kept on their their Judaism underneath. And later on, he ended, this is not proven, but there is a strong probability. Later on, he just emigrated to Egypt, where near Cairo, in Old Fustat, there was an important Jewish community where he flourished, became one of the leaders of the community, then the leader, and very much involved in public, in community affairs, in public leadership, and so on, in addition to his great scholarship, both in halakha, in Jewish law, and in philosophy. So that is really one of the most remarkable men that Jewish tradition has. This combination of the three, both a great rabbinical scholar, not a great, one of the greatest philosophers, and involved in daily life and in public affairs, at least towards his old age. All this in one career, in one lifetime, is really amazing. Now, what was Maimonides' project? What was he out to achieve as an intellectual and as a thinker, as a religious thinker? First of all, he wanted to bring rational metaphysics, rational philosophy and science into the religious sphere. For him, rational knowledge, understood as metaphysics and physics at that time was very difficult and half esoteric science. He wanted to bring them into the religious sphere and to endow them with religious significance and value. In other words, rational knowledge, knowledge of the world, knowledge of the nature through science. Of course, Aristotelian science, we are talking about Aristotelian science. This is why I said before that the paradigms of rationality change. But science and Aristotelian science were understood to be exactly the same as today, say, quantum mechanics and science are understood to be the same, or as Newtonian science in its time and until our own time was understood to be science, full stop, period. So at that time it was Aristotelian science, and metaphysics are not additional interesting disciplines that an enlightened person can indulge in order to develop his mind. They were not just an intellectual interest or game. They were religiously important. This was Maimonides' view. They were important for a religious purpose. And a religious person should pursue them as the highest religious achievement, because the intellect has to lead to a higher religious achievement than even the mitzvot, even the commandments. So, in order to achieve or to pursue this view, he made a very strong distinction between what the commandments mean and the role they have to play in religious life, and what knowledge has to play in religious life. Those of you who know about Aristotle would recognize the Aristotelian element here. In Aristotle, too, there is, for the general public, there is an ethics and a politics which should be rational, but whose rationality is not very elevated. And then for a small minority who, not a small, for a minority who can be more versed in science and metaphysics, the real intellectual achievement, the real metaphysical unification with eternity, the Aristotelian parallel of religious salvation, is through knowledge. Maimonides accepts that, as did Ibn Rushd, his Muslim colleague, also born in Cordova. He accepted this, but he transplanted it into Judaism into religion. He was a Jew, so for him, religion was through Judaism, as something higher even than the commandments and of religious importance. Because through metaphysics, or as Aristotle understood it, metaphysics is also the knowledge of God. You know God and you know the divine world, and through physics, you know God's creation. And these are two domains of knowledge which he designated by the Hebrew metaphors. I'll say it first in Hebrew, then I'll translate. Maaseh Merkava and Maaseh Bereshit. Maaseh Merkava, the affairs of the chariot. The chariot is a symbol taken from Ezekiel, Yechezkel, to metaphysics, to the secrets, to the top secrets of the universe. And the affairs of creation. Creation is the physical world, the seen world, which physics and the other sciences study. That is knowing God and knowing God's creation as a religious project, not as something additional to religion, but through it, religion itself attains a higher degree. On the other hand, the mitzvot, the commandments for Maimonides, were only rules for action. They were practical decrees whose sole function was to tell the Jew what to do in certain circumstances. They were not supposed to provide the subject matter for intellectual exertion and effort. They were not supposed to be something you discuss, you study, you argue about. They are not supposed to be the subject of a theory. They were only practical injunctions. The Sabbath has arrived. There are rules to know to figure out when it comes. There are rules what to do. Your husband was deceased. There are rules. For everything there are rules, and the rules are for being followed, not for becoming the subject of an intellectual discussion. Which means, and he was very strict about it. Now what does it mean? What does it imply? It implies something very revolutionary and to most rabbis very dangerous. It implies that most of the work done in the Talmud, especially in the Gemara, which is the main body of the Talmud, and most of the work done in the Jewish yeshivot, in which the main theme was arguing and analyzing and making fine points about the text of the Talmud, is a spurious waste of time and a waste of intellectual energy that could and should be spent on different matters, namely on science and metaphysics, on the knowledge of God and the knowledge of God's creation. So when Maimonides did this huge, this immense, this admirable project of compiling all the Jewish mitzvot and arranging them in a logical way in his Hayad HaChazakah, his main aim seems to be, as he himself says in the introduction to that book, that no one, I paraphrase from memory, that a person of a Jewish creed would be able to look at this book as a kind of a manual, not as a theory of the mitzvot, but as a manual. One of those how-to books that are filling American New York bookstores today. How to correctly fulfill the commandments. And once you have this guide and you follow it, you do everything that is necessary, everything that is both necessary and sufficient. in terms of the commandments, in terms of the mitzvot. Now, the intellectual energy that we have, the intellectual powers, the powers of argument, of analysis, which Jews have shown so brilliantly to possess, should be placed elsewhere, in knowledge. Not knowledge of the law, but knowledge of nature and knowledge of God, that is to say, science and metaphysics. This is the project the part of the Maimonidean project, which I said before had failed. Of course, this did not happen. However, Maimonides does say in the introduction to Mishneh Torah and Hayad HaChazaka are two different names for the same book. He says in the introduction something which made very people angry, because he said, I'm offering this book so that an Israelite, a Jew can, I paraphrase from memory, a Jew can take the old book and this book and will not require any other book between them. Meaning, you'll have the Bible, then you'll have this codification of the Jewish law, and you don't need anything between them. Not even the Talmud, because the Talmud is resumed in this book. Now, I know there are different readings of this, and this is so shocking to certain ears that it has been explained away in a variety of ways, by Maimonides himself, by the way, because he had to retreat, and he had to retract, and he had to apologize, and there was a whole diplomacy involved there. And we have to read his own retraction as part of the dynamic of the sociology of knowledge and the diplomacy of knowledge, and not in some rigid way. But that was part of the novelty in his project, which, by the way, failed, because had Maimonides succeeded in this project, we would have had, instead of legal scholasticism as the major bulk of Jewish learning, we would have metaphysical scholasticism, as later in the Christian and the Catholic tradition. But that did not happen. Now, let me now discuss his concept, move to Maimonides as philosopher, and discuss his concept of God. Well, his concept of God, of the deity, is the most transcendent concept that is logically possible at all. By transcendent, I mean that God is out of this world, not of any kind with this world. There is no one single attribute that comes from our experience in this world, and even from our language, that can be substantively attributed to God. He is the absolute other, the absolute beyond, and in this sense, the absolute transcendent entity. Maimonides here, this is when I said he was 90% Aristotelian, the other 10%, but the 10% at the top come from Neoplatonism, for those of you who know Neoplatonism. Following that, his most negative motivation was against imagining God in a human form or in a material form of any kind. The materialization of God was for him the utmost form of idolatry. Now, it is true that Maimonides is very famous and very interesting for having said that the Torah has spoken in the language of common people. Dibra Torah bilshon bnei Adam. The Torah has spoken in the language of people, or common people, which meant the following doctrine. It meant that the language of the Bible is such that it addresses different levels of understanding belonging to different segments of its audience according to the level of understanding of that audience. If it's low, if it's high, if it's intermediate, there is a message using metaphors, using symbols, using narrations, using fables, and so on. There is a certain there is a certain level which would meet the level of understanding and the intellectual level of all kinds of, which means that the Torah speaks in many voices, but says one thing, the same thing through all those voices, and there is an interchangeability, a translatability of metaphors and allegories between the different levels. Now, this is a kind of liberal in the sense of not being too harsh on people of lower understanding, giving them something, recognizing their needs and believing that the Torah recognizes their needs. But there was a limit. There was a limit beyond, there was a limit underneath which any use of material metaphors, bodily metaphors, to describe God was no longer an admissible translation of a higher idea. It became idolatry. It became a philosophical error of the first degree and a religious sin. Now, the materiality of God, so to speak, which he combats, has also various levels according to the various levels of the various human groups. First of all, obviously, God should not be imagined as a body, as having a body. Secondly, he shouldn't be imagined as having emotions, which means also that he shouldn't be imagined in the human image. There should be no anthropomorphism, as we call it. We ought not imagine God in our own image as a person, as a subject, as we say today. And of course, no change is allowed in God, because God is eternal. You cannot attribute to him one emotional state now, another emotional state afterwards. He is pleased, he is angry. You cannot, because this is change, you cannot attribute to him emotions at all, because this is anthropomorphism. You cannot even attribute to him the process of thinking, because this is copied from us. So you see that there is an attempt of purifying God from all attributes that belong to human experience and to the natural world, denying those attributes to God. Maimonides said that all we are allowed to attribute to God are negative attributes. Negative attributes, namely to say what he is not, and to say that he is not all those things which I just mentioned and other things. If you say he is not a body, he is not a person, he is not in change, he is not in time, he is not someone with emotions and so on, then this is the only way, the only proper way to speak about God. And if you take it seriously and you do it step by step by step, then you are undergoing some process of purification. Your image of God becomes more rarefied, more purified, less crude, and you advance not only philosophically, but you advance religiously as well. Now, of course, if this takes place, then the first break, the first rupture between Maimonides and popular religion has taken place, because popular religion adheres to all these things, needs of all these things. Popular religion has God in the human image, changing, having emotions, and so on and so forth. So there is already a break with the popular religion. But that is not all. This is only the first stage which Maimonides takes. He still takes another stage, which is perhaps more important, more interesting, because the first stage, so far, is not only Maimonidean. There's a whole group of theologians, Jewish rabbis among them, also Muslim, Christians, who said the same, who wanted to purify the image of God of all these things, and What they said was God is an entity, a spiritual entity, beyond all anthropomorphism, beyond materiality. He's omnipresent, he's omnipotent, he's infinite, he's absolutely good, he's absolute being, and those kind of eminent attributes that they have attributed to this supreme being. Maimonides tells us that this is idolatry too. This is what makes Maimonides so interesting. How come? You might ask. But this is so rarefied, this is so abstract. What have we done when we just said he's omnipotent, omnipresent? I mean, he's not a person, not a body, but omnipotent, omnipresent, absolutely infinite, absolute being. What's so wrong with this? What is wrong with this, says Maimonides, is that we are still using concepts and attributes taken and categories taken from this world, taken from our own experience, our own logic, our own language, which is the language of finitude, and affix them, attribute them to the one, to this absolutely transcendent God which is beyond all these categories, beyond any such expression. We are still, in other words, attributing positive, substantial attributes to him. And that is philosophically wrong and religiously wrong too. So in the second step, Maimonides sets out not just against the crude, superstitious multitude of believers, he sets out against what he calls the multitude of rabbis, or something that he elsewhere calls the learned multitude, those who are theologians but who are ordinary theologians, who are some kind of, you might say, banal theologians, who conform to some elevated view of God but cannot go beyond it. And his real fight, Maimonides' real fight, is with them, not with the simple believer out there, a popular believer who materializes God. Of course, he has a problem with them too, but that is not the specific problem he has. The specific problem is with those, so to speak, elevated theologians who, for Maimonides, on a strict, rigid philosophical, not rigid, on a strict philosophical principle, are blasphemous, no less than the one who says that God has a long white beard. Philosophically speaking, it's the same. So you see a radicalism here. You see a quest for an absolute purity that does not compromise. He will compromise elsewhere, but he does not compromise here. So what can we say about God? Only two different types of attributes can be attributed to him. First are those negative attributes I mentioned before, what he is not. And the second kind is what Maimonides calls the action attributes. You can describe God's products, God's actions in the world, looking upon our experience, nature, history, human affairs. You see moral things, you see natural things. You can look upon those as products of God, but by ascribing his products to him, you have not known and not reached anything in his own substance. You have not known anything substantive in God. You only know the externalities or the manifestation. He is so radical on that at a certain point, more than once in the Moreh, he says that even existence we cannot attribute to God. We cannot even say he exists. Now you will immediately say, what does it mean? There's no God? No. Our concept of existence too, he says, is he takes existence to be an attribute, which most philosophers today don't, but that doesn't matter. Our concept of existence, he says, is also bound to earthly existence, to our own experience. We don't understand another concept of experience but the one which belongs to our own world. And therefore, when we say, when we attribute existence to God, we attribute to him the kind of existence under the meaning that we hear in it. And that again is wrong. I'm running out of time, so I'll move now. I leave the problems of creation and so on. I'll say a few words about prophecy, my second topic, and about the Jewish people and the mitzvot. Maimonides' theory of prophecy is fairly simple to understand, but very relevant to the kind of project, philosophical project I have mentioned. The prophets for Maimonides had three distinctive qualities. First, they were philosophers of the highest degree of philosophical comprehension, a novelty. Very few Jewish leaders, intellectuals have said that. They were first and foremost philosophers. Had they not been philosophers, they will not enjoy the high religious level that they do. Here you can see the religious worth of philosophy and knowledge for Maimonides. Second feature, they were endowed by an exceptionally developed and creative imagination, which allowed them to translate, to transpose their own philosophical knowledge, which is based upon concepts, to translate it and into fables, images, allegories, and stories, and to produce thereby what we know as the Bible. The Bible, when you take a look at it, seems confused with many contradictions. It seems to be attributing to God a body and even a face, and to do all kinds of intellectual horrors on the surface. This is what makes reflective people perplexed. This is why Maimonides calls his book The Guide of the Perplexed. He wants to explain this enigma to the people who say, "Oh, well, look at the Bible. This is so crude." He said, "This is not crude as you think, because this is only Torah speaking the language of the people. And this is what the prophets were able to do, to translate the highest conceptual philosophy into such seemingly crude language so that people will get some gist of what it is about." Now that, of course, leads... And the third element in defining the prophets was a very high moral profile. So they were philosophers of the highest degree, they were creative artists of the highly developed imagination, and they were of a high moral intuition and profile. Now, of course, that determines immediately Maimonides' system in Bible interpretation. And as you can imagine, it is a very strongly allegorical system. At least half, if not more, of the text of the Moreh Nevuchim is doing this allegorization, this allegorical interpretation of verses and concepts in the Bible, trying to give them a philosophical meaning. Spinoza, as we shall see if we have time, objected to both these ideas. The prophets were not philosophers. They did not understand the high philosophical truth. They had only the two other qualities, namely they had only a highly developed imagination and a true moral sense. And what they did, they translated their true moral... What does a true moral sense? You may say a true moral intuition, not understanding, intuition. So what does moral intuition mean? That you know what is right, but you don't know the reason. You don't have the whole philosophical system to justify it. So what they did, they translated their moral intuition, their true moral intuition, using their developed imagination, as in Maimonides, into the Bible. So the Bible really teaches only a moral lesson, but it does not teach any truth about the universe, about God, about nature, and so on. Well, this will be Spinoza's position later on. You see, I'm smuggling already some some information about him. But Maimonides' position was on the contrary. The Bible is a tract in the highest philosophy, the highest metaphysics. It has all Aristotle in it. It has both metaphysics and physics wrapped up in symbols. So this is a major difference. For Spinoza, there is no teaching whatsoever about cognitive affairs, about scientific and metaphysical affairs in the Bible, because the prophets didn't know anything about it. They were not philosophers. They were only moralists with a highly developed imagination. Another difference that would arise immediately between Spinoza and Maimonides on that issue would be, of course, that the Bible is intellectually on a lower level than philosophy, because the prophets were not philosophers. Philosophy is something apart. The Bible is something apart. The Bible is important, but it is lower because all it can give you is a moral truth translated into images, and not even containing its own justification in itself, because there is no philosophy there, only moral intuition and imagination. You can always also see how one of these men remained within the Jewish tradition, fought to remain, and this is why he made the prophets philosophers, and the other has rejected the Jewish tradition based upon Torah being given by God to Moses. But I still am with Maimonides. And I have to speak about his theory of commandments, which is also a very interesting and important issue. You see, Maimonides, towards the end of his book, Moreh Nevuchim, deals with the commandments, with the Jewish commandments, which more or less, at least in medieval times, perhaps not in our time, but in medieval times, defined the Jewish identity. And he, being a rationalist, being a proponent of reason, tries to give a rationalization, that is to say, a rational explanation to the mitzvot, to the commandments, which he does in two different and parallel ways. The first way, which I shall not discuss, and which takes the bulk of the chapters, is dealing with the specific mitzvot, with all these mitzvot he knew very well from his other book. He categorizes them, and each category he shows that there is some rational function, some rational ground why this group of mitzvot is binding. And most of his rational grounds are utilitarian. This is good for the body, it's good for the mind, it's good for politics, it's good for the community, it's good for all kinds of terrestrial, practical matters. It's very, very down to earth. But then, after he has spent so much time discussing all these mitzvot and giving them sometimes plausible, sometimes implausible explanations, he raises a more interesting question, I think a more interesting question. What is the ground for there being mitzvot in general? Not what is the ground for kashrut, or what is the ground for Shabbat, or what is the ground for this and that and the other thing. What is the reason, what is the ground for the fact that we have mitzvot in general at all? And this is a crucial question for Maimonides, I think, also as a person. Because if you think of his other part of this philosophy, which I have elaborated perhaps a little one-sidedly because I didn't give you the middle, I didn't have to go into the middle of the book, then you may ask, why should a philosopher, why should a religious philosopher of Maimonides' kind bother with mitzvot at all? Isn't that part of the popular religion which a philosopher who rises above a certain level according to his scale doesn't need anymore? And that's a very important question. And the tension which I mentioned before about Maimonides exists actually. It exists in him, I think, and it exists in readers who are open-minded and who want to know what was going on, what is going on in the text and what is going on in the man who wrote this text. A tension is visible. Now, they have been given. Now, Maimonides says one thing, which the late Yirmiyahu Yovel was very fond of stressing. He said that there are two ways of fulfilling the mitzvot, one lishma and one shelo lishma. Shelo lishma means for a utilitarian purpose. Kashrut has a utilitarian purpose. Lishma means for their own sake. You fulfill the commandments not in order to be healthy and not in order to be this and order to be that. You fulfill the commandments because they are commandments, for their own sake. And this is a higher degree of practical Judaism than the utilitarian in which you really negotiate with God. You are in the market with God, accumulating credit in his bank and so on. This is crude religion. Pure religion is to follow the mitzvot for their own sake. Higher degree. But then you ask the question again, why? A Maimonidean should have this at all. Several answers have been given to this question. Some people have said for political reasons, and Maimonides does mention this. We need a mitzvah to organize our lives, to have a community, to have safety, to have commerce, to have all kinds of things which we need for society. This is the political explanation. Another explanation that has been given is that Maimonides, in an atavistic, in something very deep and primary in himself, showed loyalty to the Jewish identity. He couldn't separate from it, and so he went into the mitzvot in such great detail. Now, there is some plausibility in both explanations. They are not sufficient. They have problems. If the political explanation is the one, then why use a Jewish law? The Goyim too have politics, they have law, they have jurisprudence. What makes the Jewish law so important politically? The second explanation sounds a little dogmatic. But you are talking about a philosopher, so what is his ground for this fidelity, for this faithfulness? You have to give some kind of a ground if you are a philosopher. So there is some plausibility. They do not explain enough. And I think that a third explanation, perhaps the most important, has to be added, and I suggest that it is the following. What do the mitzvot do? They enter an element of sacrality, of sacredness into daily life. When you eat, you say a bracha. When someone dies, you do this. Whatever you do, you don't go on in an ordinary way about your business. You stop and sanctify it. You stop and sanctify it. And by doing this, you kind of represent, or you kind of concretize, God's transcendence. God's transcendence, God's being so alien, so far away, so beyond everything, is a source of religious metaphysical fear. Maimonides says so. It is also a source of an experience of fear and trembling, of sanctity, of something extraordinary. Before a God like this, you don't just stand, you stand with a certain aura. And the mitzvot translate, the commandments translate that aura, translate that sanctity into daily life and inject it into our daily experience. So wherever a Jew goes, if he keeps the mitzvot, then he has a concretization, an indirect representation of that transcendence, this frightening and overpowering transcendence of God wherever he moves, he or she moves. And that is a reason which, for there being mitzvot in general, and for Maimonides having the kind of philosophy that he has, going for the mitzvot. Now let me briefly move on to Spinoza. We are jumping half a millennium, that's very easy, 500 years or more. from Cordova, from Egypt to Amsterdam, the son of Marranos, whose families have been secret Jews in Christian Iberia for generations. They come to Holland, they become Jews again, but they're not really Jews, they are not really Christian, they are a mishmash of both, and they are trying to create a Jewish identity on the elements and ingredients of a Christian mind. They have children. Of course, all kinds of things can happen in a community like this. One genius child comes out and says, neither Judaism nor Christianity are the truth, only universal reason is the truth. So his parents and grandparents were first Jews, then Christians, then both Jews and Christians, and he ended up being neither Jew nor Christian, as a kind of a dynamic that can be explained, and I have tried to explain it in writing. Now, by the way, I'm now using my last minutes to do injustice to Spinoza, but I feel more comfortable doing this to Spinoza first because, I mean, he has had the life of greater suffering anyway, but also because I have done some work in writing about him in this book, Spinoza and Other Heretics, and whatever I cannot say here orally, I can say to you in writing. But let's see what the differences are. I have already mentioned the difference about prophecy. That marks two worlds. If the prophets were only people with imagination, then the Bible is a product of the imagination. It is not a product of high learning. It is of high knowledge. It is only a product of the imagination, translating a moral intuition. Now, therefore, also, you don't have to allegorize the Bible. You don't have to understand it with allegories. You have to understand what the prophets actually meant. So he became the father of biblical criticism, of the high biblical criticism. To understand what they meant is to understand the language, the history, the sociology, and to study the Bible as a scientific object, as we study everything else in nature. Now, about his view of the deity of God is the very opposite of Maimonides. If Maimonides has projected the most transcendent image of God possible, Spinoza has projected the most immanent image of God possible. Immanent meaning that God is only in the world and actually God is the world. There is a famous place on the side, as his custom is, where he says nature or God, meaning nature is God. But that should be taken very carefully. Some people believe that what he was doing was reducing God to the level of nature. But that is to interpret Spinoza in terms of a philosophy which is anti-Spinozistic, which makes a difference between two. You might as well say that he elevates nature to the level of God. The level that Christianity and Judaism historically have given God over nature, now nature rises to that level. God descends, they become one. Now, if they become one, then God is not a person, as in Maimonides. God does not think or want or change. God's will, God's decrees, says Spinoza, are not in the Bible. They are written in the laws of nature. God's will is a metaphor explaining the necessity of natural causes and natural laws. And that excludes, of course, miracles. It excludes the greatest miracle of all, which is creation. The world has not been created. God did not create himself. God, nature, existed eternally, as in Aristotle. There's no creation. There is no miracles, because everything happens according to the laws of nature, which are the laws of God. And there is no private, particular revelation to Moses, to Muhammad, to Jesus. They were all prophets with some moral understanding, but they were men. They were human beings all. And what also goes away, that is important now for his image of Judaism, is the idea of the elect or the chosen people. The chosen people, the idea of the chosen people is not something that stands in itself. It represents the whole idea of providence, namely the idea that history is a sacred history which God has designed for the world and which he runs from above. When Spinoza secularizes the idea, and I don't have time to explain how he secularizes the idea of the chosen people, he said that the election of the Jews was a political election, the success of their political life in this world and not anything beyond that. In secularizing the idea of election, he secularizes history. He takes away the idea of providence, he takes away the idea of God being some kind of a super director running history from above or through some script that he interjected into history, and he makes history a completely secular affair, something that you would study and understand just as you study and understand nature. The natural sciences, the historical understanding, and historical sciences have the same method, and they are all subject to the causal laws, which are the only divine laws, the only laws of God. Now, finally, he secularized also the mitzvot, the commandments, but in two ways. First of all, he took them away from the particular Jewish context and universalized them. He said, if the Bible expresses a moral intuition through images, then we have to see what this moral intuition tells us. What is it all about? His answer, the moral message of the Bible can be boiled down to two ideas: justice and mutual help. Solidarity, mutual help. In Hebrew, in the Hebrew sources, ve'ahavta l'reacha kamocha, they should love thy neighbor as thyself, which the Christians also took. And if you look upon this is really the gist of what we call the prophetic ethics, the ethics of the Jewish prophets, which he crystallizes into a very minimal form, universalizes, takes away. It no longer belongs to the Jews, nor to the Christians, nor to the Buddhists. It belongs to all men and women who have reason and who have a moral sense. And so there is a universalization of the message of the Jewish prophets into something which Spinoza calls the universal popular religion. He now is not for a religion that is based upon revelation, Jewish, Christian, Muslim, so on. He is for a religion of reason, which is attained through every person's mental capabilities. But this religion too has two levels, as in Maimonides: a high level, which only philosophers can attain, and a more popular level, which is basically moral and which is based upon the morality of the Jewish prophets, universalized and taken out of any historical context, any context of a particular revelation. So in one sense, what he does is to go beyond Judaism, beyond Christianity, to some modern secular or half-secular religion of reason. But at the same time, it's very interesting, the baggage that he takes into that universal religion, the message which now ought to characterize the universal religion of all humanity, is the message of the Jewish prophets, secularized and universalized. And in that sense, this is one of the ingredients, one of the points in which Spinoza, with all his heretical attitudes towards the Jewish religious Orthodox tradition, maintains fundamental Jewish ideas and universalizes them for the benefit of humanity at large. Now, I've only started, and my watch says that I have finished. So I will respect the watch. If there are a few questions, I will be glad to answer them. But I understand that I'm not allowed to continue very long. I see nothing. Yes, please. Yes, please. I'm not here to state my beliefs. Yeah, okay, go ahead, but you can do it.
I believe that the Red Sea was parted by flying saucers friendly to God, and they did it on behalf of God, but God didn't do it himself. And I also believe that the Jews were fed by manna for 40 years in the wilderness, again, by good flying saucers, and not by God himself. The flying saucers acted on behalf of God.
Well, statements of belief can only be made and respected. Yes, please.
I'm curious if Maimonides was born in Spain, and what made him live in Egypt? Because Jews are not supposed to live in Egypt.
Why were Jews not supposed to live in Egypt?
Jewish people, we could shop in Egypt, we could visit Egypt, but we're not supposed to live there because we were freed from the land of God.
Oh, well. The new Egypt was Spain. At that time, the new Egypt was Spain. And the new Pharaoh was the sect of the Almohadin who forced the Jews to convert. And as I said, there is good reason to believe that Maimonides' own family has converted superficially. And so to find refuge from this persecution, he emigrated to Fostat, to Cairo. And at that time, there was a very big and important Jewish community there. You know, you heard about the Geniza, the Cairo Geniza.
And the other question is, like in the article book, you talk about
Sorry?
God with an outstretched arm, slow to anger, a jealous God, slow to anger, quick to forgive.
All these are metaphors from Maimonides that have to be explained away allegorically. If you take them literally, this is blasphemy. Yes. Yes, please. Towards prayer? Well, for Spinoza, it was meaningless because he believed that, as I said, that the only religious value lies in action and not in ceremony. And the action is the action according to the prophetical morality. For Maimonides, it was more important because Maimonides believed in ceremonies. But there is an interesting place in Maimonides where he says, and this is very disturbing to some readers, not to me because I am only a scholar, but to some readers who believe in prayer, where he says that there is a historical change. For instance, the Jews were ordered to have sacrifices in the old days. And then this kind of barbarous custom was necessary to educate them in an old time when they're very, very crude. But nowadays, I mean, if we have our temple again, forget it. We don't need that anymore. We are more civilized now. And there is a place where he says maybe prayer will have the same fate. Maybe prayer will have the same fate. But he doesn't elaborate anymore. So some people hang to it and some people are very upset by that. That's in the Moray. I'll have to look it up. Yes.
Herman Cohen went out of his way to defend Maimonides against Spinoza. He felt there was a certain hostility on the part of Spinoza toward Maimonides. Herman Cohen wrote a whole chapter.
Yes. I think Herman Cohen was wrong about this. There was not a hostility in Spinoza against Maimonides. Spinoza really felt greatly indebted to, I think, to at least 3 or 4 Jewish thinkers. Maimonides, first of all, Rabbi Yehuda al-Fahar, whom is a minor figure but who influenced him, Ibn Ezra, and Crescas. And Christos Crescas. These 4 were very important in his formation. Of course, he polemicizes with him. But that's not hostility. He did feel hostility, however, to the Jewish rabbis of his time, and his hostility he sometimes gets even with them, very probably because of the exchange that he was banned, he was thrown out of the community. There was a cherem, it was very harsh words against him as a young man of 24, and there are signs of bitterness in his Tractatus Theologico-Politicus against Jewish leaders against Jewish leaders, but not, I think, not so much against Maimonides. Now, Hermann Cohen disliked Spinoza on philosophical grounds, because Hermann Cohen believed in transcendence, and Hermann Cohen believed that there is a God and there is man, and there are two different things, and there is a correlation between them. Maybe I'll mention it next time when I speak at the background for Buber. And he was very much afraid of Spinoza. He also was afraid of the universalism of Spinoza, that Spinoza, as I said, takes the prophets and goes to the goyim. But ironically, what happened was the very contrary, that Hermann Cohen universalized Judaism. He wrote a book showing that Judaism is the best Kantian philosophy, and writing pamphlets which are called Deutschtum und Judentum, Judaism and Germanism, and he wanted to synthesize that. And what came of that, you know. Yes.
Say a word about Maimonides' ideas about providence.
That's a very difficult question. Maimonides, I haven't mentioned that, but Maimonides covers his views with all kinds of linguistic masks. And he declares that he's doing it, but he doesn't tell you where. He just tells you, this is the game, you find out. And I think that providence is one of them. Because his son, he has problems with providence, of course, naturally. So he discusses all kinds of views, ordinary views in philosophy and theology about providence, and dismisses them. And then he is left with something that can be read in two ways. One, on the face of it, as if he comes back to some idea of providence. But if you really decipher it, I think that what he says is that providence is rational behavior. If the word of God is reason, God's guidance is reason. Providence is guidance. God's guidance is reason. So if you make reason the guide of your life, you have the better chances of having a good life and avoiding danger and conducting your affairs in a better way. And this is really getting around the problem of divine providence and almost secularizing it. This is one reading, I admit. I don't think that you will get the same reading in a Chabad yeshiva. Yes. Can you speak up, please? Well, I think that the 13 principles were written for large consumption. You see, Maimonides had a problem which he called the problem of the multitude. Every second step in the Moreh is, this is a secret, this is only for you, this is for those who understand it, this is for the happy few, and so on. He had a problem not to disclose his, let's say, his authentic views, or maybe authentic is wrong, his more refined views to a general public. When he wrote the 13 principles, he wrote it more or less in the spirit of the Mishneh Torah, of the Mitzvot, which is designed for a larger public. And I think this is the way in which they ought to be read. It will be not very correct methodologically to try and understand Maimonides' own mind through this list. Another question, and I think we'll call it a night. Yes, please.
Would you say that Spinoza is something in the sense of a seminal figure, or did he have a major impact on other schools of philosophy, other philosophers, or was he sort of less so?
You mean outside the Jewish? I hope that would not sound as promotional, although it is. The second volume of my book, Spinoza and Other Heretics, gives you a very detailed answer in a full book. Let me just mention who is discussed there. I call Spinoza the philosopher of immanence because of the immanence that I explained. And I'm saying that without being Spinozist, that is to say, without being his direct disciples, very few people are his direct disciples in that, followers and continuers of the idea of the philosophy of immanence were the major thinkers of modernity. And I go through the following names: Kant, Hegel. I could have gone through Schopenhauer and Schelling, I just didn't have time or patience. Heine, Moses Hess, Ludwig Feuerbach, Karl Marx, Friedrich Nietzsche, and Sigmund Freud. All of them were philosophers of immanence. They did not agree with one another, nor did they agree with Spinoza, because each wanted to understand the philosophy of immanence in a different way. But they all were faithful to the idea of immanence, of which Spinoza was the great initiator. In that sense, you can write a history of modern philosophy with him, starting with him rather than with Descartes, as is usually done. Okay, I thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. For more information on the 92nd Street Y, New York, and all of our programs, please visit us at 92ny.org.